Good afternoon. My name is Sheila and I'm a volunteer for the Danvers Historical Society. I'd like to welcome you to the Danvers Historical Society for one of the events we're doing for the Essex National Heritage Trails and Sales program. Today we're in the Page House. We're going to talk about one of the women who lived here in the Page House. Page House is one of the historic properties owned by the Danvers Historical Society. But first I should give you a little background of the Page House itself. Jeremiah Page, who was a bricklayer who moved here from Medford, Mass. To Danvers, ended up marrying a local woman, Sarah Andrews. And they built this home in 1754. They eventually would have 9 children while they were living in this home. You may have heard about Sarah Page from a program we did back in May. When the Revolutionary War and protests started, especially the tea tax protests, Jeremiah signed a petition not to drink any more tea. So he told his wife Sarah not to serve tea anymore under the roof of his house. When he was away for the day, she found a way to still invite her friends and actually serve tea on the roof of this house. So we talked about that program in May, but we're going to talk about a later generation of a woman who lived here. Sadly, Sarah died in 1776. And Jeremiah married Martha Crosby, and they had 3 children. So he had 9 children with Sarah, and he had 3 children with Martha. When Jeremiah passed away in 1806, his son John, who was one of his and Martha's children, inherited this house. He moved in with his wife, Mary Fowler Page. We're lucky enough to have portraits of John and Mary. So this right here is John Page, and later in life, and this is his wife, Mary Fowler Page. As I said, they inherited the house in 1806 and moved in here. During their time they were living here, they had 10 children. So as I said, John and Mary lived in this home and they had 10 children. We're going to talk about the youngest child, Anne L. Page. And this is a charcoal painting of Anne much later in life. And then we also have one picture of her when she's a younger woman, probably in her 20s. Anne L. Page is one of those mid-19th century, early 20th century women who was very active. She was born in this home in 1828, and she would die here in 1913. So she lived for 85 years. During those 85 years, she accomplished quite a bit. She was probably in many ways very much like her grandfather, who was involved in the American Revolution and would be involved in other revolutions in the United States, including the abolitionist movement, and she was a suffragist, and she was also an education reformer. We don't have much archival material about Anne's involvement in the abolitionist movement, but we do know, like many families who were contributing to the abolitionist movement, she and her family had a little box that you would get from the anti-slavery organization. And you would keep this on the mantle of your home, and you were to put pennies in it. And then eventually the money would go to the Anti-Slavery Society. And this actually belonged to Anne. So we have a few items that actually belong to her. The suffragist activities, we don't have much information on that. We do know that in 1882, Anne and a group of women here in Danvers formed the Danvers Women Association. They held their first meeting here in the Page House. And one of their many goals was to help society. And this was what Anne was doing in many ways, but also to fight for the right to vote. So she was a true suffragist. It's her role in the world of education revolution that we're going to talk about. In 1850s, after Anne had finished high school, she didn't go to college, but she was very interested in a unique idea. She wanted to have a school to teach very young children before they went to the first grade. So Anne convinced her parents to let her hold the classes here in their home, but they also had a barn at the time, and probably most of the classes were held in the barn. As I said, we're not sure where Anne got this idea of teaching very young children, but she was fluent in German and in French. And about this same time in the 1850s, there were articles being written over in Germany about an idea called kindergarten. and it was created by a gentleman named Frederick Froebel. Frederick Froebel grew up in Germany and had gone off to college to be an architect. But instead of becoming the architect, he started to establish schools for young children. What Froebel thought of, or was often seen, is that children have a natural instinct to want to play, sing songs, play games, be out in nature, and that they love to create and they love to build. He was seeing children taking sticks, building things with sticks, and so he decided that he would figure out a way of taking this natural instinct to teach them to read, to write, to learn geometry, learn about botany and other sciences as well. So he took some of his architectural skills and actually created toys. They are called Froebel gifts today. And a lot of them were building blocks, so these were wooden building blocks. We have examples of original ones that were called kindergarten blocks later on. This is an original set, and today they're actually reproductions that you can get. So he established these wooden blocks. Milton Bradley here in the United States took up this idea and started to mass produce these and sell these once kindergarten schools start to be established all over. As I said, Froebel also believed in taking children out in nature and letting them explore. And this is something Anne had a strong belief in. Her mother, Mary, was actually very much interested in plants and would be probably today considered a master gardener. And sadly, when her father died in 1854, a few years later, her mother, Mary, decided to build onto the house and build a conservatory, which is on the other side of the home. Mary was probably the one who would teach the children about plants, as Anne would take them and teach them other things. We're very fortunate that there is a student of one of Anne's classes who wrote about attending her kindergarten class. Her name was Alice Witherby. And Alice wrote about going to this Miss Page kindergarten school as a young child. She remembers that Miss Page would greet them at the door and that she was very kindly and sympathetic toward children in all ages. One of our students that attended her school was Alice Witherby. We're fortunate enough that a few years later, Alice decided to write an article for the Danvers Historical Society about attending Miss Page Kindergarten School. Alice talked about that Miss Page would be at the door greeting children as they came in, that she was always smiling and very kindly, but could be stern when she needed to be. She also described how Miss Page would be dressed very simply, and that Alice even talked about that she had these wide black shoes that Alice thought were very unattractive. But Miss Page would say they were very practical. Miss Page believed in dress reform for women of the time period as well. Alice also talked about learning the parts of the plants, and that even when she was older, she still could identify the parts of a flower. One of the things that Alice talked about was singing songs, and one of them was the alphabet song. This was a song that was taught later on in many kindergarten schools. It came from Frederick Froebel. It was a fun way of learning the alphabet and saying the words with the alphabet. And interesting enough, you can actually hear, and we'll play it for you, an alphabet song. There were three brothers who were children of Eastern European Jewish people living in Brooklyn, and they attended a kindergarten school in the late 1890s, and they learned this alphabet song. These brothers later on would use it in their vaudeville act, and actually even later would use it in movies they made. They're called the Three Stooges. So we're going to play you one of their singing this alphabet song in one of their movies that you can find on YouTube.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to test your mental sit down. I'm going to test your mental coordination with a little sit down, with a little number called swinging the alphabet. Swing it, brother. Right. I'll explain it so even you can understand. My colleagues will assist. Ready, sister? Get that junk out of here. Come on, boys. Scram. I'll give you the idea in a nutshell. B-A-B, B-E-B, B-I-B-I, B-O-Bo. I'll give you the correct demonstration. Cutie pie, pound those horse teeth.
B-A-B, B-E-B, B-I-Bicky-Bye, B-O-Bo, Bicky-Bye-Bo, B-U-Boo, Bicky-Bye-Bo-Boo. C-A-C, C-E-C, C-I, sicky-si, C-O-so, sicky-si, so, C-U-Sue, sicky-si, so, Sue.
Get the idea, girls? Now we'll all join together on the letter D.
D-A-K, D-E-D, D-I, dicky-di, D-O-do, dicky-di-do, D-U-do, dicky-di-do-do. F-A-F, F-E-B, F-I, bicky-fi, F-O-Fo, bicky-fi-fo, F-U-Boo, bicky-fi-fo-boo. G-A-J, G-E-G, G-I, dicky-di, D-O-do, dicky-di-do, G-U-do, dicky-di-do-do. La-da-da-da, H-A-H, H-E-E, H-I-Hickey-hi, H-O-Ho, Hickey-hi-ho, H-U-Hoo, Hickey-hi-ho-hoo. J-A-J, J-E-G, J-I-Dicky-di, J-O-Jo, Dicky-di-do, J-U-do, Dicky-di-do-do.
K-A-K, K-E-T, K-I-Kicky-Kai, K-O-Ko, Kicky-Kai-Ko, K-U-Koo, Kicky-Kai-Ko-Koo. L-A-Lay, L-E-Lee, L-I-Licky-Lie, L-O-Lo, Licky-Lie-Lo, L-U-Loo.
Early that go, M-A-May, M-E-Me, M-I, Mickey-My, M-O-Mo, Mickey-My-Mo, M-U-Moo, Mickey-My-Mo-Moo.
So I hope you enjoyed the Three Stooges singing that alphabet song. It's ironic that we would be able to actually get to hear what that song was by listening to the Three Stooges. As I said, Alice talked about going to school at Mrs. Page's kindergarten class, and she said later on in life that she realized she was a very fortunate child to attend one of the first kindergarten schools in the United States. Later on, Anne continued to have these classes in her parents' home. Sadly, her mother passed away in 1876. When Anne finished that 1 year of teaching kindergarten in the North End, she decided to come back to Danvers, and she opened her own academy. She called it the Page Normal School Academy. We don't know if she held the classes inside this house or did she rent space nearby. But we do know that she taught from 1885 to 1901 running this academy. Anne was very proud of many of her students. They were coming from all over New England, and she actually, interesting enough, had one student come all the way from Utah. Some of her students went on to start up their own normal school. Edith and Olive Leslie were two sisters who went to Anne Page's school. And Edith Leslie ended up establishing the Leslie Normal School in Cambridge. Today it's Leslie College. Her sister Olive went off to Labrador and opened the Anne L. Page Kindergarten School there. A couple of her other students, Catherine Coleman and Catherine Lee Bates, ended up being professors of education at Wellesley College. In 1912, they decided to build a huge building to be named after Anne Page, and it would be dedicated to early childhood education. Anne influenced a lot of young women in her years of teaching. She also influenced Danvers as a whole. She was asked to join the Danvers School Committee in 1901. She tried to persuade the town to spend the money for kindergarten schools in Danvers to be free. They refused to do that. So the Danvers Women Association that she helped form back in 1882 decided that they would establish kindergarten schools in Danvers and they would pay for it. They persuaded Anne to return, who had retired, to come out of retirement and to manage the school for them. Besides teaching young children and later on young adults to become kindergarten teachers, Anne also wrote articles about the kindergarten teaching methods. She was one of 4 authors who wrote a chapter about Froebel in the book called The Kindergarten to School, which was published by Milton Bradley. She also wrote articles for Elizabeth Peabody's Kindergarten Messenger magazine. Anne became very ill after 1910, and she passed away in 1913. She didn't live to see the dedication of the Anne L. Page Memorial at Wellesley College in her name, but it still stands today on the campus. One of her friends, James Hughes, in 1924 was asked to write a chapter about Anne in a book called The Pioneers of the Kindergarten in America. James Hughes talked to many of Anne's students, and he also talked about her spiritual and intellectual growth and how she inspired many others to expand their spiritual and intellectual growth as well. James talked about an interesting event he had with Anne Page. He came to visit her, and he took her to a meeting of educators in Essex County. At the meeting, they were talking about raising funds to build a statue of a general who fought in the American Revolution, who was born right here in Essex County. He doesn't say who the general was, but he also stood up and said, "It's nice that you're doing these statues in memorial to these brave men, but you should also think about the noble women who were born in your county." And he pointed to Anne Page and said, "Here's a woman who's given many contributions, not only to Essex County, Massachusetts, the United States, but the world in general, to education." Sadly, there is no memorial to Anne L. Page here in Danvers or in Essex County. Maybe someday when they're building a new school, they might name it after her. I also feel that Essex County, it would be wonderful if one day they would build some type of memorial, not only to Anne Page, but also to Elizabeth Peabody and Mary Peabody Meehan, 3 women who were born here in Essex County and were instrumental in the idea of spreading the idea of the kindergarten movement. One of the things we wanted to show you too before we end is that we have these 2 little school desks that were actually used in Anne Page's kindergarten classes. Those are one of the few things we have besides the building blocks. The other thing I forgot to show you were these booklets. When Anne was teaching these adult students, they would create these booklets. This is about folding papers, and they would also keep this, and this would be their guidebook. This was owned by one of her students, Maud Whitman, who donated it to the society many years later. Maud also donated these paper geometric shapes to the society and the kindergarten blocks that we have. She also had a book. This was to teach children about weaving. So again, this was an instructing book that the teachers would make for weaving when they would teach the children how to do it later on. We do have a couple of photographs of some of Anne's students. This one, we don't have the names of the young women in the picture with her, but here's Anne, and these are probably her students who might have attended the normal school that she established here in Danvers. One of the things we also wanted to do, because we introduced Anne Page to the 3rd grade program, I wanted to make a doll to represent Anne. So I had made this recently to represent Anne Page in the 19th century. I also like to read to you something that Anne wrote about going from the 19th century into the 20th century. So it might give you an idea of how progressive her thinking might be. She wrote to one of her students who were complaining about going into the 20th century. "You must not get out of tune with the 20th century. I'm privileged to do so, as I had nearly 75 years living in the 19th. The 20th century will be a grand time. I love it and like it already. It is the time for stirring things up, and when they are well stirred and settled again, they will be better than ever." So I'd like to thank you today for joining us here at the Danvers Historical Society and in the Page House. We hope you'll check out our other programs that we offer on the Danvers Historical Society website, and be sure to check out the Essex National Heritage Trails and Sales events that are going on the next 2 weeks. Thanks.